Hi guys, so a turnaround is a short chord progression that you play at the end of a song to take you back to the beginning for a repeat. Its entire purpose is to get you to the dominant chord at the end of the form, ready to play the one chord that's usually found at the beginning of a song, thus creating a 5-1 perfect cadence as you repeat the song. Now, a turnaround typically lasts 1 to 2 bars. It's sometimes notated in lead sheets, occasionally in brackets, but sometimes it's not notated in lead sheets. You might just find that a song ends on a 1 chord all the way, for a couple of bars at the end of a lead sheet. Either way, you can and you should really insert turnarounds at the end of the form before you repeat and go back to the beginning. And of course, only insert a turnaround if you're going to repeat the form. The whole point is that you create that 5 chord to lead you to the 1 chord at the beginning of the form for another round through the form. If you're ending the song, don't insert a turnaround because you're not turning around. In that case, you just play and hold the tonic as normal. Now, as mentioned, the whole point of a turnaround is to get you to the 5 dominant chord at the end of the form. Now, there are lots of different common turnarounds that do this, and I'll take you through a few of the most common ones now. And all these turnarounds will be in the key of C, and they're all going to last 2 bars. And so assume these are the last 2 bars of the song, of the form, before we repeat and go back to the start of the form with a 1 chord. So the simplest turnaround you could do is just a 1 chord followed by a 5 chord. Next, instead of just having a 5, you could insert a 2-5. Or you could expand that out even further and have a 3-6-2-5. Or you could create a 2-5 chain. So a 2-5 in D followed by a 2-5 in C, for example. Or probably the most common turnaround that you'll come across is a 1-6-2-5. Now, these are all very typical standard turnarounds that are very widely used, and they are quite simple because they're all diatonic. That is, they are using chords only derived from 1 or 2 keys. But jazz musicians, being jazz musicians, often take these simple turnarounds and make them more interesting and complex. One particularly complex turnaround is called the Tad Dameron Turnaround because it was created by the jazz pianist Tad Dameron. And it can be seen in his composition Lady Bird, as well as in other standards like Half Nelson and Israel. Now, the Tad Dameron Turnaround is a variation of the 1-6-2-5 turnaround. So we take a standard 1-6-2-5 turnaround, but replace all the minor chords with dominant chords. So we're essentially creating a cascade of secondary dominants, going from the A7 to the D7 to the G7. And then we tritone substitute all of the dominant chords, leaving us with this. as a little aside, you can also tritone substitute just some of the dominant chords, for example the first and last one, and leave the middle one unchanged and create a really nice chromatically descending turnaround that sounds like this. But back to the Tad Dameron Turnaround. So at the moment we have a C major 7 going to an E flat 7, A flat 7, D flat 7, and resolving back to the C at the beginning of the form. So up to this point, this is all pretty standard and well established and commonly used stuff, right? We're using secondary dominants, we're using tritone substitutions. That's really the bread and butter of jazz. But then Tad changes all of the dominant chords into major 7 chords. And so it sounds like this. Now this makes absolutely no sense. There's no real theoretical justification or explanation for this. Not only do major 7 chords not substitute for dominant chords, because they serve completely opposite functions. A dominant chord is supposed to build tension, which then resolves to a major 7 chord. But we have also lost the entire purpose of the turnaround, because we are no longer ending on a dominant chord ready to create a perfect cadence with the 1 chord when we repeat the form. And indeed, you can hear the difference. I'm going to play the secondary dominant turnaround and then the Tad Dameron Turnaround, and I'm going to pause on the last chord of the form before hitting the wrong chord, or an incorrect chord, not the tonic chord, when I repeat. And have a listen to whether or not it sounds strange or funny or incorrect to you. So first, the secondary dominant turnaround. Right, so you listen through the turnaround. I paused on that G7, and your ear really wants it to resolve back to the C. It's really pulling you back to the C. We're expecting to hear the chord C, so that when I play an E flat major 7, it sounds a bit off. It sounds like I played the wrong thing. Now let's do the same thing with the Tad Dameron turnaround. Right, that time I did the same thing. I played the turnaround, I paused on the last chord. Because it was a major 7 chord rather than a dominant chord, it wasn't really pulling you in any particular direction. We didn't feel like there should be a particular chord that needs to come next to complete the progression. So that when I played that E flat major 7 chord, it actually sounded okay. It sounded, complete and fine. It didn't sound to our ear like I had made a mistake. So we've lost that pull back to the tonic chord that we got from the dominant chords. Now, the closest I can come to a theoretical explanation is that a major 7 chord is very similar in terms of the notes that are being used as a dominant chord, right? There's only one note difference, even though that note happens to be the 7th of the chord, which is a very important note, and you don't want to be, playing around with the 7th too much. So the chords do share 3 out of 4 notes, so they sound somewhat similar, and they still use quite smooth voice leading, with the bass note moving down either a perfect 5th or a semitone, which always sounds quite smooth, and chord progressions that move down either by semitone or by perfect 5th in the bass note or the root note of each chord typically sound strong because it's kind of following the circle of fifths. It's a tonal sequence that we're all used to hearing. So the chord progression is kind of doing those things, and like I said, voice leading quite smoothly, but it still doesn't quite work to my ear, right? Because we don't have a dominant chord. That dominant chord isn't pulling back to the tonic chord. We really could play the C, then 3 random chords, then the C again, and it would still sound okay, because ultimately we're just returning back to the chord that we started on, right? That by definition kind of rounds the circle. But it doesn't really have that same pull that dominant chords create. But Tad Dameron clearly thought it sounded interesting and good to his ear, and so did other jazz musicians who used this turnaround, like Miles Davis. Right, so the key takeaway from this lesson, I suppose, is that just because something doesn't make theoretical sense doesn't mean that you can't use it, doesn't mean that it's not going to sound good, and doesn't mean that it's not going to become widely adopted and used by other musicians in their own compositions. So the Tad Dameron Turnaround makes absolutely no sense, but is still a widely used little progression and still sounds interesting. Certainly grabs the listener's attention. You know, we're waiting for a whole bunch of dominant chords to take us back to the top, but instead you've got all these weird tritone substituted major 7 chords. Strange, has a weird kind of logic to it, but doesn't quite technically work, I suppose. But doesn't mean you can't use it, you know? Why not? If it sounds good to your ear, you use it. Who cares what the theory says? Cool, and that's it. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.